Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Kent Redfield, the Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Springfield, and talk about if Governor Rauner has ruined his reputation among GOP voters, whether the Illinois Supreme Court would approve of redistricting reform, and what we may see from both parties as the 2018 election cycle approaches. This runs about 50 minutes.
Kent Redfield, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Good to be here.
It's been a while since we had a chance to speak. You and I had worked together, or at least at the University of Illinois Springfield for a couple of years when we were doing the Illinois Channel planning study, and you were there for many years. Just for a quick background for those who don't know you, so they can put some of the rest of your comments into some context. What was your career, and what were some of the areas of political science you focused on?
Okay, I started out at the university in 1979. I actually came here in 75 to work for the General Assembly. I staffed local government committees, and when I came out to the university, I did a focus on Illinois politics. I ran an intern program for the General Assembly where we place interns with partisan legislative staffs, and in the early 90s, I got involved doing research on campaign finance in Illinois, worked with a non-for-profit group for more than 25 years.
Is that the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform?
Yeah, the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. And
what was the goal? I mean, they're still around. In fact,
sure.
Before I go off on that tangent, what was the goal and the objective of that organization?
Well, it's actually founded by Paul Simon and and Bob Crestra, who was the lieutenant governor for Governor Edgar, and they wanted to open up Illinois' political system in terms of campaign finance reform, transparency, ethics issues, and so it was intended to be a bipartisan effort to kind of move Illinois politics out of the good old days or the bad old days that were in full swing when I got here in '75.
So more ethics, more transparency in government. I want to go more into some of the campaign issues of what we're dealing with now, but as you look back over those years since 1979, was any progress made, would you say?
Oh, we're much more ethical than we were, and after putting all the governors we put in jail, that might sound a little strange, but the standards that we apply, the openness that we have in government is much greater than back then. We don't have the petty corruption. I mean, we still have some major scandals, but over time we've eliminated a lot of the petty corruption. The culture has changed. It's not where it should be or where I would like it to be, but it's much better. But part of that is from the perspective of how bad it was back in the 50s and 60s and early 70s.
As somebody who's observed Illinois state government and studied it for close to 40 years now, how do you put into context where we are today? And where we are today, in my estimation, we have Republican governor, Bruce Rauner, and yet for recent actions, he is now being divorced, or many Republicans are divorcing themselves from him. Senator Kyle McCarter, conservative from Southern Illinois, has gone up and made videos on YouTube. You have Chris Roebling, who's a political commentator and Republican commentator, I should say. He's on WGN, often given his political analysis. About a year ago, I interviewed Chris Roebling, who said Bruce Rauner was the best thing to happen to the Republican Party in Illinois in 25 years, in part because of his money that he could make the Republicans competitive. And for the viewers, let me just the other day, Chris Roebling came out with an article saying that lambasting the governor now, kind of indicative of how many Republicans have changed their minds, saying Rauner did not work with others. He did not stop our financial slide. He got nothing done. He lied to all of us. I'm reading from different segments here of his article. He lied to all of us by saying he would veto HB 40 and then doing the opposite. HB 40 was the bill that would allow for funding of abortions in Illinois, which Bruce Rauner signed. And Roebling says he played us for fools. Worst of all, he got nothing done, and said Bruce Rauner is damaged goods. He cannot win in 2018, therefore he should not run. So what are we to make, and how odd is this political, as we're on the eve of 2018, what will be a huge race for governor between the Democrats and Republicans in Illinois? What are we to make of this?
Well, it is, in some ways it's very surprising, but in other ways not. I mean, Bruce Rauner is governor because of the failure of Illinois politics, both Democrats and Republicans, over the course of, I mean, things certainly started to collapse in the second half of George Ryan's administration, and he ended up going to jail, and Blagojevich made it worse, and he ended up going to jail, and Quinn, when he was governor and the Democrats controlled the legislature, we really didn't address and solve those fundamental problems. And so Bruce Rauner is the result of the failure of politics. Wasn't a politician. He'd never run for public office. And there was kind of an implicit agreement that people knew that Bruce Rauner was not a social conservative. And certainly that's a big, that's one of the major groups within Republican politics are social conservatives. But Bruce Rauner offered the potential to come in and change the fiscal situation to, and be able to do things with unions, with business climate. And so there was this kind of bargain that was struck with the social conservatives that they would in fact back Rauner, even though they knew they weren't going to get anything they wanted on social conservative issues from him. They weren't going to get anything out of the Democratic legislature anyway. And therefore that seemed like a reasonable kind of accommodation. And so if people think back, one of the people that was a big funder and supporter of Liberty Principles PAC, which is Dan Proft's group, which is very active in the events we're just talking about, there was a guy named Jack Rozier. And Jack Rozier was an extreme social conservative, but he was also a fiscal conservative. And he reached an accommodation with Rauner and agreed to back him. And so you had this the part of a core group within the Republican Party that was saying, okay, the governor can, if we elect Rauner, he can get things done. And now you fast forward to this year, and we've passed a budget over the governor's veto. We passed the legislature did, and we passed a tax increase over the governor's veto. Now the governor, who never claimed to be a social conservative, has signed this bill about that provided Medicaid funding for abortion, and and therefore he is you get this huge reaction. We were willing to ignore all of this because he was going to get things done, and now we can't deliver. And so, I mean, the anger there is just amazing.
Many Republicans have said he outright lied to them, that he said he was not going to sign it. They're also angry with him for signing SB 31, which has been described by a lot of Republicans as making Illinois a sanctuary state, that police officers cannot detain someone based upon their immigration status. As we sit here then, how does Bruce Rauner get the nomination if people are just going to sit on their hands? And as Chris Roebling also said, his money won't matter because his commercials won't matter. People have made up their minds. So whereas normally having a whole lot of money would matter, it seems now that is not going to be the kind of thing, maybe a little bit like with Hillary. People had already knew who she was, made up their minds, and so you can spend a whole lot of money, but once people have their minds made up, it's virtually no changing of opinions.
Well, the governor does not, I don't believe the governor has a problem in terms of the primary. You know, he has to have an opponent, and, you know, he has...
You think he'll have an opponent in the primary?
I still think that's likely. I don't know. And whoever it is will get attention regardless of, you know, whether they have any money or not, because people are going to be interested. It's part of the story, the civil war that's going on in the Republican Party.
Right.
And so, but he has enough money, he's got enough organization. You see him out there right now. He's running these soft, fuzzy education ads that kind of, here's all these great things that have happened in education, and, you know, this is what I can do, and Illinois is worth fighting for. Now, you know, he obviously has huge trust issues with the Republican Party, and particularly, you know, with that core group of social conservatives who, you know, I mean, they were willing to back the governor because they said, well, we're not going to get some of our issues. Now they view it as the governor's essentially rubbed their noses in the things that they, you know, that they really didn't want to happen in terms of the social issues. And if, you know, they're willing to forgive that if he was funding the Republican Party, if he was getting things done in the legislature. Well, you know, he obviously hasn't gotten things done. Now, we don't know, you know, are people going to still take the governor's money? I mean, the governor's money comes into the Republican Party, and you're going to have candidates running in the fall, and some of them in the primary, that are going to have money from the Illinois Republican Party. But what, you know, do citizens know that, say, last year, 96% of the money from the Illinois Republican Party came from Bruce Rauner and a fellow named Ken Griffin and another fellow named Richard Uihlein. Now, Griffin is a kind of businessman who's probably
He's
isn't...
the, as I believe, the wealthiest man in Illinois.
Yeah, and
an investor.
An investor, not a social conservative. This Richard Uihlein is very interesting because he's been a big backer of the governor, but he's also a primary funder of Liberty Principles PAC, which is Dan Proft's organization. And, you know, there are connections there between that organization and John Tillman, who runs the Illinois Policy Institute and the Illinois Opportunity Project. It's you know,
So
it's
there's
fascinating.
just a handful of people with big pockets.
Yes.
Jack Roser, who you mentioned, passed away a couple of years ago. So now you got Rauner, Ken Griffin, Dick, I don't know if it's Uihlein or Uihlein, but a lot of people get his catalog, and I think it's Uihlein.
Yeah.
there, but,
Oh, yeah.
And so we still have this, certainly in Illinois, and I suppose you could say on the national level too, it varies. You have the social conservatives, you have the, in the Republican Party, you have the fiscal conservatives, sometimes they're one and the same, but you also have those who are just fiscal conservatives and social moderates. I guess that's probably perhaps where Bruce Rauner would describe himself as, but how can he describe himself as a fiscal conservative? What do you make of him, the governor, you know, pounding the table that he's not going to sign a budget until it's balanced, and in 3 years he never proposed a balanced budget?
Well, you know, the governor strategically sat out in 2015 that first budget that was, you know, had big gaps in it, and he said, you know, I mean, he was betting he would be able to leverage the budget against his programs, that he could bring the Democrats to the table. And he did that for 2.5, 3 years, and finally, you know, enough Republicans joined the Democrats to override his veto on a budget and on a tax increase. So
why did that happen? We
Well,
had 15 Republicans, and it wasn't just that they were voting against the governor on the budget, but they knew that they were going to be ticking him off. I'm sure he communicated that to them, and here's a guy with all this money. And going back for a moment to what you had talked about, the Illinois campaign for political reform and trying to get Here we have a number of Republicans now who voted against the governor, deciding they're not going to run again because, in part, they can't fight his money. One of them, Chad Hayes out of Danville, had a very interesting letter when he announced he wasn't going to run again, using a reference, moneyed bullies. So what does it say about Illinois democracy? Maybe nothing different than has it been for years, but where we have so much money concentrated in so few hands. Maybe that was less true of the Republican Party before Rauner. You have it with Mike Madigan, the House Speaker, controlling the purse strings as far as, because he's also the chairman of the Democratic Party. So if people buck Madigan, they're not going to get funded in their campaigns. Now it's also fairly true of the Republicans with Governor Rauner. So I guess I don't know to what extent the average person's seeing these issues, which I'm trying to just say, what are we to make of this? And you got all kinds of people now, a large amount of Republicans certainly saying they're not going to run again out of the legislature. So you're losing a lot of experience. Yeah. Give us your thoughts. I'm just trying to lay out a series of things so that people can understand, I think, the landscape as we go into this primary season and then the general election in 2018.
Yeah, and we've lost a lot of Democrats that aren't running again. And so what you've got is gridlock starting in July of 2015 that lasted all the way up through this summer. We didn't fund all kinds of programs that people care about that needed to be funded, and so a very acrimonious, poisoned atmosphere between a Republican governor and the Democratic leadership in the legislature. It's no fun to be in the General Assembly, and it's not like fun in terms of having a good time. It's that if you're a serious legislator, then you want to represent your constituents, you want to solve problems, you want to make things better. And what we have done is run up the unpaid bills to $15 billion, when they were maybe $4 billion when we started. And we've done long-term damage to social programs, to higher education. And there just doesn't seem to be any end in sight. In terms of, if you end up with a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature after 2018 and it's Bruce Rauner, then, how are things going to be any different for the next 4 years? So, and then the fact that you have this concentration of power and money in the hands of the legislative leaders, in terms of the Democrats, in terms of the governor, as far as the Republicans are concerned, then your ability to feel like you can represent your constituents becomes compromised. The fact that,
should a governor, let's put it this way, have other governors controlled or attempted to control the Republican caucus the way Bruce Rauner has?
No, this is unprecedented, and to have it based on primarily on the campaign contributions, on running money through the Republican Party and into the caucuses. I mean, certainly Illinois has had periods of very strong party control, and on the Democratic side, but also on the Republican side. Pate Phillip was a very powerful Senate president who had a Republican caucus. I mean, he was a Republican from I think DuPage County, and that was very tightly controlled. Everybody complains about Madigan's rules in terms of the legislative process of it being very centralized. A lot of those were borrowed from Pate, were first instituted by Pate Phillip and the Senate Republicans, the decade before, and that Madigan came into control. So you've had party control, but to get this kind of to have it based in money, Rauner's money on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, you look last cycle legislative races, you've got labor unions, you have big law, trial lawyer firms, and to a lesser extent you have health facilities, which are hospitals, nursing homes, who if state government pays, spends a lot of money on health care, then they are primary beneficiaries of state government spending a lot of money on health care. And so, they are funding $50 million worth of legislative races, and the governor and Ken Griffin and Richard Ueland are funding $50 million from the other side. And, then you're...
And the winners are the TV stations and the advertising guys, right?
And if you know that the other side can come after you with big bucks, then you want to be friends with somebody on your side that has big bucks. And so you've had this escalation within the legislature. And, if you look at, just briefly, the governor's race, what makes a billionaire attractive to the Democrats? J.B. Pritzker as a candidate, never run for public office, haven't done too well the last 3 years with a businessman, being governor. Why would Pritzker be attractive?
I mean, you got another billionaire with no political experience, as we have with Bruce Rauner.
Right, but J.B. Pritzker can self-fund, and if he self-funds, then...
And he can fund downstream as well.
Even if he doesn't, the Democrats, the big labor,
can save their money to put on the House races.
Yeah,
right?
and so, and that's, if we're making decisions on the basis of who gives us the best strategic advantage in terms of spending money, rather than who's the best person to guide the state out of this mess, who can bring the parties and and get the public behind them to make the hard choices. That's that's what I think is particularly destructive about this is you're
so
losing
it might be interesting
contact.
to watch the 2018 election without question, I think. On the other hand, I want to get to how do we save Illinois, or is Illinois just lost in this vortex of big money politics and big egos? What's the answer on that one? I mean, do we get to any solution where, I mean, here, as you mentioned, we went basically 3 years without a budget until the Republicans voted to override their own governor because they were just so frustrated. I would add that Christine Radogno, who was the Republican Senate leader, went to John Collerton, the Democratic leader, in essence saying, the governor's not putting together a budget, so why don't you and I do it? Then Rauner comes in and picks up the phone and calls the Republicans, who Christine Radogno had said to Collerton, we'll put votes on this, and the governor interjects himself and says, don't vote for it, undercutting the Republican leader of the Senate. She, I think, mostly out of frustration with his rule, resigns from the Senate. And so nothing's getting done. I guess I'm kind of confused trying to follow all this. What is his goal? Do you have any inkling? Because if he doesn't propose a balanced budget, even though he demands that there be one, if he interjects himself when he verbally says, I'm for the grand bargain, but then picks up the phone and tells people not to vote for it, I don't know where we are or how anything. Illinois is in a crash dive, and who's going to step in to grab the reins? At what point does policy trump politics here?
Well, and it is the fact that the governor made a lot of strategic errors in terms of trying to leverage his position. He's clearly miscalculated. The governor knew that the state needed revenue, and it also needed serious budget cuts. I mean, we need to trim what we're doing to the essentials, and we have to provide revenue, and we should have a better, more broadly based way of getting that revenue. I mean, everybody knew that, and so he was trying to leverage essentially holding up, crashing the state, or the prospect of crashing the state, as a way to get what he wanted, which were business reforms. I mean, he was always willing. He never said we don't need revenue. He may have at one point.
He was saying we need revenues, but we need reforms as well.
Yeah, reforms first. And so it isn't. It's about. It isn't about policy versus politics. It's about how do you how do you get within the political system the kinds of compromises and agreements that you need in order to solve things? Because that's the way the political system is designed.
Are we going to get that
If things get bad enough, we got a little bit of that by Republicans coming over and saying, you know, I'll sacrifice, in some cases, I'll sacrifice my career because, you know, we need to get to the, you know, we need to get beyond this impasse and then hopefully start talking about, you know, what are the compromises. You know, it isn't that we failed because of politics. We failed at politics. The design of the system demands that you reach accommodations. If you have gridlock, you know, if you don't have consensus or compromise, the American political system defaults to gridlock. And the governor tried to use that gridlock in order to leverage what he wanted to accomplish. You know, again, an experienced politician, you know, a Ronald Reagan, a Tip O'Neill, see that...
Or Jim Edgar.
Or Jim Edgar, and in this case, Mike Madigan, say, you know, let's find some common ground, because if we don't, nothing's going to get done. Yeah.
I want to get, before we run out of time, I want to get to, going back for a minute, on the Republican primary. There's conversations. No one else has said they're going to run in the Republican primary as yet, but there's conversations about various people being speculated. Some people say Jeannie Ives, who's a very conservative House member, she's a graduate of West Point. Other names are mentioned. My question is, in your estimation, for the sake of discussion, if the Republicans were to nominate a conservative, a hardcore conservative, given the political lay of the land in Illinois, can a hardcore conservative be elected statewide?
I think that's very difficult. I think Pat Quinn was not a great candidate, and you know, and running against. You know, he ran against you know, Senator Brady, who was a downstate social conservative, and in a midterm election, you know, Pat Quinn won. I mean, this state is very hard for a Republican to win in unless they appeal to moderate suburban voters, and I think you would have way too many wedge issues that you would use against a social conservative. You know, that person would run great downstate. They would be terrible in Chicago, and they would lose. And you know, they would, you know, if they're all they're doing is breaking even in the suburbs, Chicago's going to outvote downstate every time because of the numbers that are involved. So I think it's very, very difficult to you know, and if you got a social conservative, then you know, we don't know who the Democratic nominee is. You know, assuming just kind of normal default sorts of things, then you get Mendoza versus Munger, the comptroller candidates from 2 years ago. Now, it was in a presidential election, and Mendoza didn't run as well as Hillary Clinton did. But when you know, you don't, even with $10 million, people didn't know who was running for comptroller and what they did. So I think it's hard.
I sometimes look at the lay of the land around Illinois, and I tell people, in my estimation, Illinois has a geographic problem. In that, 2/3 of the population lives in the Chicagoland area. So much of a concentration of population that when Bill Brady ran against Pat Quinn, 2010, out of 102 counties, I believe Bill Brady carried 99 and lost the election.
Yes.
Which goes to show the concentration of power, the concentration of votes, and that results in too much political power being held in too few hands. If you look at other states, in Missouri, you got a Kansas City balancing a St. Louis, the power is diffused. Am I right? I mean, what is your read of that? I mean, because it seems to me the only 5 people that matter politically in the state of Illinois is the governor, the Senate president, the House Speaker, the mayor of Chicago, and perhaps the president of Cook County Board. Some people might say you don't even need to go to the Cook County Board president. So you have 4 or 5 people that are controlling primarily all the strings.
Yeah, and again, the economic activity and the population is certainly concentrated, and and when you get one party rule, that can that can certainly be a problem.
Why do we not have a Republican Party in Chicago?
Well,
For practical, I mean, why is it that for 70-something years, Cook
we
County
have-
almost votes as a block for the
Yeah,
Democrats?
we have Republicans in Chicago, but we don't have much of a Republican Party.
They're not competitive.
Yeah,
lately.
organizationally.
I mean, the Soviet Union had more competitive races than we have out of coming out of Chicago.
And that used to be true of the suburbs for the Republicans. Now it's happening downstate as old-style Democrats, Southern Democrats retire, they get replaced by Republicans. We're going to get, downstate's going to be more and more one party.
We have what I call the Truman Democrats. They're pro-military, socially conservative, but they're union guys.
Right.
The coal miners and others of Southern Illinois. But they've been switched for a lot of social issues, I would say, primarily.
Yeah. And the jobs have left. With deindustrialization of cities downstate, of urban areas downstate, the loss of mining jobs, and so we have real problems with regions. Regionals, we have regional conflict. We've got economic segregation and racial resegregation in the suburbs, and we need leaders that are going to try to pull the state back together. I mean, downstate is important to Chicago, because of the agricultural base, because of the transportation system. It's not like that we don't need each other in terms of the state, but it's so easy to polarize, to say, oh, it's just,
But it is concentrated power in the Cook County area.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's no question about
and we
it.
don't have any downstaters running, as we had Jim Edgar running. Is it a mistake that those candidates who are running, I believe I'm right to say none of them picked a downstater for their lieutenant governor candidate?
And we had one that picked the mayor of Cairo, and that may have been Pawar, who just dropped off. But you look at Kennedy, at Pritzker, and at Biss, and we're talking about, we're trying to win a Democratic primary, obviously, but still, it's about what's your base and where are the votes, and Rauner has a suburban.
Is it a political mistake for none of those candidates who have reached out to the Southern Democrats and to say, pick an Andy Menard perhaps as a running mate, or somebody who has some state experience, who knows the lay of the land, but also can represent, the people of downstate Illinois?
Well, I would like to see that. Obviously, as a downstater, I want to, I want to see more attempts to get to cross the lines that have been drawn regionally in the state of Illinois, because we have to, we need each other. We've got to solve problems, but we don't have, Illinois has always had trouble with an identity. We don't think of ourselves as, we think of ourselves as Chicagoans and suburbs and downstaters, and we don't have a common kind of, Illinois identity. And that's a disadvantage, because we're in this boat together.
I was going to say, who controls, who are the power outside of politics? Mm-hmm. In other words, outside of political office holders, let's say. Who are the power brokers? Is it business? Is it union leaders? I sometimes wonder why we talk about the bad business climate in Illinois. The Governor Rauner has made that a major point. Why do we not hear more from the business community in Illinois? We hear Greg Bays talking up for the manufacturers often on some of the issues that he champions. But you don't get, and Illinois has some of the biggest businesses in the world.
No, we have a lot of very, very important companies within a variety of sectors, and there's an Illinois Business Roundtable, and it's really a who's who, and there were times where Illinois we had a huge fight over workman's comp in the 70s and into the 80s, and eventually, big business and big labor got together and worked things out because it was hurting the state competitively, and we need people in those communities to come together. But we also need political leaders to bring them together. We had a time when, the business community became very interested in education. Now, part of that was they wanted better people coming out of high school, to come into their companies. But you changed the landscape in terms of the education policy because business got engaged, and so labor needs to get engaged, business needs to get engaged, health, the different sectors.
Does the average voter have a voice?
Well, it needs yes, you need to be represented. You always have a vote. You always have a voice. The problem is when we pull the state apart into regions, then people think in those terms rather than, what do we need for the state? Why do we need a broad-based, revenue system? And then when you have redistricting the way that it is done in Illinois, it's Democrat and Republicans seeking advantage, and what gets lost is representation. It's the connection between the citizen and the legislator. So
I wanted to jump in just on that because that's where I wanted to go. One of the things Governor Rauner wanted to champion, and he's given voice to it, I think a fair person would look at the governor's comments on redistricting and say he's right, that and to your expertise, looking at voting trends and good government and what you worked on in your career, how much is the redistricting, which again sometimes can be archaic enough that the average person doesn't see that, but the way we draw the political boundaries of the Senate races, the House races, they lump Democrats into certain groups, they lump Republicans on others, and a great number of these legislative races, at least in the past, you have incumbents running without any opposition.
Yeah, we take advantage, we will draw lines to give advantage to one party or another or to incumbents, and we'll minimize competition wherever possible, and then where there's competition, we want to put our thumb on the finger, our thumb on the scales in order to give ourselves the advantage. And when redistricting is about partisan advantage, then representation gets lost. The city of Springfield is represented by 3 state senators, none of whom live in Sangamon County. If I say, gee, I want to go to the Illinois Senate and I want to represent Springfield, I can't do that. Now, Springfield is large, has enough people to, be the center of a Senate district. It's and that has coherence. People, where are you from? Springfield. What are you concerned about? Springfield in terms of economic development, being a vital area and stuff. People can get behind that, and so it's about representing people rather than partisan advantage.
You end up, as you mentioned, having very few House districts. Let's take or Senate. Mm-hmm. Very few House districts. The Republicans need a net gain of 9 seats, I believe, to take control of the House.
Yes.
But there's very few seats available that are even remotely competitive. They picked up 4 seats last time. With all the incumbents leaving, they're going to have a hard time, I think, holding on to what they have. Is Illinois, as you look at other states, I presume you've looked at other states just for points of contrast, are we less democratic the way we do things here than in other states?
Well, I think we're less
in terms of democracy.
Yeah, we're less representative. Yeah, no, I don't think we do a good job of doing legislative districts and House or Senate to focus on representing people, and that's that's a real problem. And when we concentrate power in the hands of the legislative leaders. And
the governor.
And become so dependent on money, again, that carries the day. If you have a wealth primary if you have to have a certain amount of money in order to be viewed as in any way viable, then you have a large group of people who might contribute who are never going to get into the ball game. Now, political parties used to do a lot of that. They used to do a lot of that in terms of the goals were patronage and a bunch of other things. But party organizations done correctly can provide some of those can take you can use that organizational strength. And you don't have to be a millionaire or a billionaire to run, but right now, most local party organizations are very weak, and that allows people with money, organizations with money, to come in and pick candidates often that have you get situations where the people in the local community who they would put forth never makes it to the starting line.
Let me, we're going a little longer, and I apologize,
No.
but let's just, the governor, one of the things that he backed, on the other hand, a friend of yours and mine, Cindy Canary, also backed this, and she's a lifelong Democrat, I believe. So you had Cindy Canary working on the same project that the governor, of trying to get redistricting on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. Now, the Supreme Court struck that down. For technical reasons. I mean, basically they were saying that they were giving the Auditor General of the state duties that were not in the Constitution.
Right.
Pat Quinn might have had a point in his criticism when he said of that, basically you guys could have passed this, you just made it too complicated.
Right.
If you had just written it simpler, it would have gone through. Is Quinn right, or do we also have to worry about politics in the Supreme Court? Do you, I mean, I'm asking you
Okay,
obviously,
sure.
But from your standpoint, would the Illinois Supreme Court sign off on a fair redistricting proposal which had, I forget, far more signatures to get it on the ballot
Right.
than were needed, like twice as many?
Right.
And what is your estimation?
Okay.
Can we have the population, Democrat and Republican, rise up and say, give us fair districts?
Yeah. The people that wrote the remap proposal wanted to take the legislature out of it. They wanted an independent commission, and they didn't want the legislature doing any of the choosing, any of the mechanics. The Supreme Court said no. But clearly you could design a process to produce an independent redistricting commission where the legislature was involved. The public is always going to be more suspicious, but if the Constitution says, if you're going to do this, you have to have something that's clean, that just involves the legislative article, certainly you can design something. The key to that is the criteria. If you say that you cannot take party into account, cannot take partisan advantage, can't take incumbency into account, that you have to affirmatively try to represent communities of interest, geographic areas, political boundaries, then you've got criteria in there that you can go to the Supreme Court and sue. You can, there's judicial...
You can always challenge on anything.
Yeah,
right?
There's judicial review.
I guess the essence of my question, though, is do you think the Supreme Court, and I respect members of the court, but some people would argue, if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, that they're going to be political as well and vote it down because they don't want to change the status quo.
The current court, I don't believe that's true. I think that you have gotten unanimous or nearly unanimous decisions on a lot of important things. Pensions was one of them. You did get a split on, but a strong majority to throw the redistricting proposal out. I don't think you get the kind of, there are 3 Republicans and 4 Democrats on the court, but they've been pretty bipartisan in terms of the way they've approached issues, and I don't view them as being an institution that has been corrupted by the politics. I mean, you certainly could not have contended that about the courts within Cook County when Mayor Daley was Richard J. Daley was in his heyday. I mean, he ran the legislative, executive, and judicial branches were all under, in Cook County, were all under his control. Separation of powers was irrelevant because, you know, they controlled all three branches of government. That's not the case here.
It always seems like there's one last thing, but so let me say one last thing. Just last week, as we taped this, we had an unprecedented action in Cook County, which is the Cook County Commissioners voting to repeal a tax that had been put into place, the sweetened beverage tax, which was a real populist uprising, abhorring this tax, maybe because people could understand a tax on soda where some of these other things are a little bit confused and hard to get your head around. Does that vote stand by itself, or do you imagine that there's going to be an awakening, or is it more of a reflection of the kind of what the Trump phenomenon, that we just have so many people out there who feel so put upon by government that could the Cook County tax, and the example that was now voted out because there was such a public uprising, is that conceivably the match that lights a bonfire of public revulsion against over-control by government?
Well, I think that everybody should be encouraged by the fact that you had citizens. There certainly was an organizational support there, and the beverage people were funding a lot of the ads, but you really got pressure from citizens to the individual county commissioners, and that should that's positive, whether you agree with the outcome or not, because there you've got citizens or know who the decision makers are. They're county commissioners. They obviously communicated with them, and the county commissioners listened. And now they're going to have to balance a budget without the revenue, which some people are not going to like the cuts, or they're going to have to find something that is viewed as a fair way to fund it. But those are the kind of conversations that we ought to be having about what can we afford, how do we pay for it, and we need to get the citizens' voice has to go into that process. And so, I don't want that to be, it could turn out to be a whole bunch of things, but the essence of what we ought to be, how government ought to be working is there. That you have communication and awareness of citizens, communications with their decision makers, and that they listen and are responsive. But now we have to take the next step, which is that because we no longer have the revenue, then we got to put a budget together. We got to have a conversation about, how do we fund things, and so I want citizens to be, to talk about the things that they're angry about and communicate. But I also want citizen responsibility. I want citizens to understand that, there are limits, and that one has to, you've got to balance budgets, and you've got to make hard decisions about programs, about revenue. That's what we haven't done at the state level, is we have not had those serious conversations, and the people making the decisions haven't felt the pressure the way that it happened, within Cook County. That's I like local government. Local government often works well if you get those things together.
All right, Kent Redfield, we went longer than expected, but we appreciate your thoughts.
No, thank you.
Thanks.